All right, so today we're starting part 3 of your book, and we're going to start with chapter 7, our starting point. So, what is our starting point?
Starting point is conception, that first cell that's created. And what's imprinted in that cell, I guess, is the instructions for who we are as a human being. Mm-hmm. So we want to understand more about that process of what happens then. We know already, because we've been talking about it, that fathers and sons are opposite energy. Right. And mothers and daughters are opposite energy. So if I'm having a son, if it turns out to be a son, then it's going to be someone opposite energy to me. I'm expanding, so my son was contracting. I know that much. Right. I can tell that ahead of time. Right. I'm going to get a boy, he's opposite energy to me. Right. And if the woman is opposite me, a contracting woman, then she'll get an expanding daughter. So that we already know this much, know. But whether we're going to get a boy or a girl, that's something interesting to know. Right? And to this point, it's been kind of like, we don't know, Mm-hmm. So there is a way to see more about why we get a boy or a girl. So we're going to discuss that.
Okay.
We got to look at ourselves in terms of who's easier to deal with at the time of conception. Who's more open to being related? Who feels better about themselves in terms of feeling confident and stuff like that? Who's more a little afraid and you may be needing to control things and have it their way, insecure, who's more like that? So who's more ready to have a child? Who's more preoccupied with their job or something like that? You know what I mean? So the availability of the person to be in relationship to life determines who's easiest to balance. Mm-hmm. So at the time of conception, what we're seeing is that, we're getting a read on that. Because if you get a boy, for instance, first, then I was the one that was easier to balance at that point in time than the woman was. Mm-hmm. So the boy is opposite me. So in that scenario, the mother actually gets to see herself in a way through her son, gets to understand herself better through her son because they're same energy in this situation. So that's an interesting thing to see. That, if I get a boy, that means I'm the one that was more ready or more open or more available, to move on in my life, so to speak. Right. And easier to balance. So life always creates balance the fastest and easiest way. So, it comes over here, opposite energy me, because in my line, I was more ready to be balanced than in the line that you were in at that point in time. So, but there's an opportunity there for the mother to see that. In other words, if you understand this kind of thing, to see that she was not really that okay with herself in terms of where she was at in her life compared to the husband. She might have been fine, but compared to the husband, there was a difference. Mm-hmm. So she could start to question in her mind, why didn't I get a girl? And that opens up this whole thing about understanding her son better, because her son's energy is hers. And also there's one more thing that we're going to talk about right now, and that is the worldview of the child, which is really an opportunity there for everybody to learn something about what's going on.
Okay, so before you do that, so just to recap, so when you're talking about the balance of life, the person that's more open to being related will get the opposite energy child. It's like the path of least resistance.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, say for instance you have two boys.
Okay.
Those boys are opposite their father. So they're the same energy. The boys are the same energy. Mm-hmm. And if you have two daughters, it's the same thing. They're opposite their mother. They're the same energy. But behavior, the kids can be very, very different. Mm-hmm. So we want to understand what creates that behavior difference. Mm-hmm. And we could look at this as more of an individual, personal kind of thing. Mm-hmm. This is not an energy thing. This is just what's on top of that energy thing. It's kind of like the software just running the show. What makes this one act this way and what makes this one act? They're both, in my situation, contracting, Mm-hmm. But what would make them different from each other? What makes them feel different, act different, have their lives turn out quite different? Mm-hmm. So what's going on here, So, like I said, in the mating process, the one that has the more dominant worldview is imprinted on the child. So in this case, it's the opposite sex parent that imprints their worldview on that particular child. So when I'm conceived, my mother's worldview was the dominant worldview. She was more concerned in a difficult place in her life than my father was. My father was more at ease with himself, and he had his family around him and his friends, and he was part of a community. My mother came from a different place.
Right.
Another community where she converted to being Jewish so she could remarry, because she had a bad marriage the first time, and they wouldn't allow her to they wouldn't allow her to remarry in the Catholic Church. So she basically left that whole world that she was in, this Italian Catholic world, to go into my father's world so she could have a life, because she lived alone and she was not allowed to remarry for many years. So she had this opportunity in her 30s to start another life with my father. Mm-hmm. So that situation with my mother, was much more unstable and much more difficult in terms of like where she was at compared to my father's, which was around his family and his friends and everything else. He was established in Providence, Rhode Island. So, he had boys. I mean, he had one and then he had another. Mm-hmm. And then when he was in a difficult place in his business, he had a daughter. Mm-hmm. But the tendency there was for him to have sons. Mm-hmm. So, and my mother was in a difficult place when she had me, because she had gotten pregnant before she got married to my father, and she had to have an abortion to be accepted into that situation, or else she would have been an outcast from that too. They wouldn't allow the marriage if it wasn't done properly. That's how she felt. So there was these boys, and that first child was going to be a boy. I'm really the second one that they conceived in the family. And so my mother had this kind of mindset that was more dominant than my father's at the time of conception. And she's my same energy too. So I'm basically limited by that. In other words, I was given that way of thinking about things, and that's what goes on. The one that has the more, you could call it stuck worldview or more dominant worldview, is infused into the child, and it's always the opposite sex parent. Because, like I said, if it's the same sex parent, that person was more open to being related, and the other one wasn't as open to being related. So that's something that's going on there. So to understand me personally is to understand my mother's situation when she conceived me, because her way of being when she conceived me was different than when she conceived my brother.
Right.
So to understand me and the difference between me and my brother and how his life turns out, how my life turns out, is really just an inquiry into where my mother was at when she conceived us. Because my life is simply recreating her life based on that particular point in time. I'm programmed unconsciously to make the choices I need to make so I can experience what she experienced. And that's been the story of my life, up to the point where I could recognize that. It was kind of like unconcealing the unconscious at some point there, around 40, 41, when I began to recognize these things, that allowed me to take a different path, because the more I could see that was what was going on with me, the less it was going on. But it took talking to my mother. I mean, I really had to talk to her, and she didn't want to say some of these things. Right. I felt guilty about things. I felt socially isolated. I felt like I wasn't good enough, and I never felt part of anything. Talk to my mother. My mother's experience of life at that point in time was exactly that. I mean, feeling that she had done something wrong. I mean, an abortion, for instance. Me thinking that I'm never doing anything the way they need to be done. I don't have confidence in myself. So, I mean, it's socially isolated. I never felt like I could have friends. I always felt I was on the outside, never really could socialize freely with people, talk to them and just make, small talk and have fun. You know what I mean? It was always, never easy for me to be in a social situation. It was never that way. I could do business, but I could never really be at ease in a social situation. I always felt like the outsider, like the real outsider in the situations that I was in. And I made sure that I was like that. So my experience of life was simply my mother's experience at the time of conception. My life turned out like that. And that's how everybody's life turns out. We're carrying this on. So it's kind of like the opportunity of my generation is to know, okay, your starting point at conception was this. Your mother was that person at that particular time. And you're also recreating that kind of way of being in your life. And the experiences of your life are mirroring that. And the more you recognize that, the freer you become. Right. It's not just unconsciously recreating the same thing again and again and again. Me passing it down through the generations, me to a daughter and then a daughter to a son like that. For instance, if I'm an angry guy, I never came to terms with my mother being angry and why she was angry. I'm going to create an angry daughter. I'm not going to be so open to being related, maybe compared to my wife or something, so that I'm going to have a daughter and she's going to be angry too. She's going to carry on that same way of doing business, in this angry sort of situation. And given where we're coming from is separate from life and scared of life, our worldviews are basically causes for scarcity and suffering. They actually create scarcity and suffering, our worldviews. And that's the world we're living in, where things are never really able to be what they can be. People are still struggling to get clean water, to find a place to live and to get enough food to eat. There's the majority of the people on the planet are dealing with these issues. Mm-hmm. They don't have anything passed down to them at all. They're having to start from scratch all over again. Because why? Because things weren't working the way they could. 10,000 generations, we still can't afford our rent. So that's what I'm talking about, So we got to understand that, okay, I get this from the parent that's least open to being related as far as my worldview. And my opportunity is to recognize that so I can be freer in my life to be all that I can be. And the way you free yourself is by simply recognizing it. The more you see it, it's doing opposite. The more it's not running you. The more you don't see it, it's unconscious to you, the more it's running everything. Mm-hmm. So you just need to understand that. If I'm socially isolated in my worldview, I will pick people that will do that to me. I will marry people that reject me. I will pick those people out. If the situation was betrayal, like in my mother's situation, that was true. The maid of honor really took her husband right at the beginning of her situation there when she was married. So if you feel betrayed, then you're going to get people all around you to do the same thing. Right. I would pick people like that. Well, what was going on with her father, for instance? Mm-hmm. They would have him, have a worldview where he would be betrayed. Mm-hmm. By someone that he had confidence in. And where did that come from? Was it his mother? Of course. The mother of him had that kind of an experience. So if you look back through the generations, you can see these experiences get passed on generation after generation. Mm-hmm. And how can you make, your parent wrong for it? How can I make my mother wrong? Angry with my mother because of the way she was and what happened to me because of it. You understand? Who are you going to blame? This allows you to forgive people. Mm-hmm. Like with my brother. It was difficult dealing with my brother. But if I look at my mother's situation, when she had him, it was much more difficult than when she had me. So I'm saying to myself, this kid's programmed to have a very difficult life. Mm-hmm. And how can I blame him for, acting the way he's acting, scared of things or whatever? It's like my mother was very scared when she had him of certain things. And, I can understand my brother and forgive the things that happened in our relationship with each other because I understand this stuff. It wasn't like he intentionally tries to do things to harm me or something like that. It was just programmed into him to be scared of everything around him, basically, scared of me too. Mm-hmm. So it was, just something that allows me to forgive, the people that are closest to me by understanding what I've been given. So our starting point is critical in allowing ourselves to be who we can be. Because without understanding it, we're kind of like living somebody else's life and not even knowing it. We're thinking it's ours.
Right.
And we're getting used to the idea that, we're adapting to disappointment. Like our lives are disappointing to us. And we've learned the best we can do is learn how to adapt to it, until we recognize this. And then it's more a cause for action, choice. What do you really want it to be when you can see, your starting point, like where you're at. I can't get to New York if I don't know where I'm at. Right. So you really can't get moving on in your life until you know where your starting point was. And that's what this chapter was about, is just to know clearly this is my starting point so I can actually get someplace.
Right. Now, not everybody has the luxury of being able to talk to their parents, about where they were at. Sometimes the parents are no longer living. And like in my case, my father wasn't one to share information, but, but you can always look this way. You can always just look at yourself and kind of,
Well, you could talk to your mother. She's easier to deal with at the time. You had a close relationship with your mother.
Yeah.
So you could talk to her about him and what her experience was with him. And, people that have both their parents gone can talk to other people that knew their parents and what their situations were to get some sort of an idea of what's going on. But the real opportunity is for people to recognize what we're talking about in their own lives, and then to be able to explain that to their kids.
Right.
So that going forward, we have a little bit more understanding of what was going on when I was conceived.
Right.
What made me a boy, what made me a girl, and what makes me the way I am in terms of what my natural way of doing business is in the world. How I see myself and how I deal with everything around me. The choices that I'm making are really not choices until you understand that.
Right.
They're more like programmed ways of doing business, and not really a choice.
Okay.
It's just kind of like freedom versus, being trapped in a way.